In the beginning, when the world was young and unmarked by sorrow, there existed a day unlike any other, a day woven from divine breath and celestial rest, a day that would echo through eternity as heaven's most tender gift to humanity. She saw it, the sacred stillness of Eden's first Sabbath. Ellen White beheld in vision what the hurried world has forgotten, that before sin cast its shadow, before labor became burden, before time became enemy, there was rest, holy rest, divine rest, a rest that transformed mere hours into sanctuary. In those pristine moments of Earth's infancy, when Adam's lungs first filled with perfect air and Eve's eyes first reflected unclouded starlight, God paused, not from weariness, but from love. He carved out 24 hours and breathed into them something no other day would possess, his very presence. The Sabbath was not born from human need, but from divine desire, a weekly appointment between Creator and creation, a rhythm written into the heartbeat of existence itself. As written in patriarchs and prophets, God saw that a Sabbath was essential for man, even in paradise. He needed to lay aside his own interests and pursuits for one day of the 7, that he might more fully contemplate the works of God and meditate upon his power and goodness. She witnessed the original design, man, walking with God in the cool of the evening, not as subject to king, but as child to father. The Sabbath was the golden thread that wove through their communion, transforming rest into worship, silence into prayer, and simplicity into profound joy. This was no burden imposed, but blessing bestowed, no law enforced, but love expressed. The Sabbath came as naturally as sunrise, as inevitably as rainfall, as gently as a father's embrace. Ellen White saw beyond the veil of time to that first sacred sunset, when twilight painted Eden in colors that have never returned to earth. She understood what modern hearts struggle to grasp, that the Sabbath was not given to restrict, but to restore, not to limit, but to liberate. In her visions, she beheld the tender care with which God established this holy time. Each Sabbath hour was a love letter written across the sky, a divine signature upon the week, a promise that even in paradise rest was sacred, stillness was valuable, and communion with the Creator was life's highest privilege. The world would change, sin would enter, thorns would grow, but the Sabbath would remain, carrying within its sacred hours the memory of Eden and the promise of restoration. Through the corridors of time, Ellen White witnessed how this divine gift would travel, like a precious heirloom passed. From generation to generation, the Sabbath carried within its gentle embrace the very heart of God's love for humanity. She saw it, the tender intention behind heaven's weekly appointment. In her visions, the Sabbath was not a cold commandment chiseled in stone, but a warm invitation written in starlight. God knew what humanity would face: the endless pursuit of gain, the relentless pressure of achievement, the suffocating weight of endless doing. And so he gifted them with holy undoing, 24 hours of divine permission to simply be. As written in The Desire of Ages, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. Ellen White understood the profound compassion embedded in this gift. While the world would teach that worth comes from productivity, that value springs from accomplishment, that rest is earned through labor, the Sabbath whispered a different truth. It declared that humanity was precious simply because they bore the image of their Creator. She beheld how God wrapped this present in time itself, making it accessible to every soul, regardless of station or circumstance. The poorest could possess it as fully as the richest. The weakest could claim it as completely as the strongest. No money could purchase it, no effort could earn it, no achievement could improve it. The Sabbath came as pure gift. In her sacred glimpses of divine intention, Ellen White saw that God designed this day as a weekly sanctuary, not built of stone or wood, but of moments, not requiring pilgrimage to distant places, but invitation to present peace, a temple that traveled with humanity wherever their journeys would lead. Each sunset on the 6th day of the week, God would unfold this gift anew, fresh mercies wrapped in holy hours. New opportunities for communion, dressed in divine rest. Another chance to remember that they were loved not for what they did, but for who they were, children of the Most High. She witnessed how the Sabbath would become humanity's weekly reminder that life was more than survival, existence more than endurance, and time more than currency to be spent. It was God's gentle rebellion against the tyranny of endless motion, his loving protest against the slavery of perpetual striving. In those sacred hours, humanity would discover that true wealth was measured not in accumulation, but in appreciation, not in achievement, but in awareness, not in conquest, but in communion. Ellen White saw it clearly. The Sabbath was God's love letter to humanity, written in the language of rest, sealed with the promise of presence, and delivered fresh each week to hearts willing to receive. In the gentle unfolding of her prophetic sight, Ellen White beheld the Sabbath as heaven's weekly healing balm for wounded souls. She witnessed how God, in his infinite wisdom, designed this day to restore what the world would constantly tear down. She saw it, the divine therapy wrapped in sacred hours. Through her visions, Ellen White observed how the Sabbath would become humanity's weekly return to innocence. Like children running home to loving arms, weary hearts would find in this day a sanctuary where pretense could fall away, where masks could be removed, where the soul could exhale the accumulated tension of earthly striving. As written in The Desire of Ages, the Sabbath is a sign of the power of Christ to make us holy, and it is given to all whom Christ makes holy. She understood that God had woven into this gift the power of transformation, not through harsh demands or impossible standards, but through the gentle alchemy of divine rest. In the quietude of Sabbath hours, stressed spirits would find serenity, fragmented hearts would discover wholeness, scattered thoughts would settle into peaceful clarity. Ellen White witnessed how the Sabbath would serve as humanity's weekly reminder of their true identity. In a world that would constantly whisper, "You are what you do," the Sabbath would lovingly counter, "You are who you are in me." It would become a sacred space where worth was not earned but received, where value was not achieved but acknowledged. Through her sacred glimpses, she saw families gathering not in obligation but in joy, children learning that there was a rhythm to life that honored both work and rest, effort and ease, doing and being. She beheld communities discovering that true fellowship bloomed not in frantic activity, but in peaceful presence with one another. The Sabbath, in Ellen White's understanding, was God's weekly gift of perspective. Like stepping back from a massive painting to see its full beauty, this holy day allowed humanity to step back from life's urgent details and behold the magnificent tapestry of divine love being woven through their days. She saw how God designed the Sabbath as a weekly rehearsal for eternity. 24 hours to practice what forever would feel like unhurried communion, unforced worship, unearned peace, a gentle training ground for hearts that would one day beat in perfect rhythm with heaven's eternal Sabbath. In her visions, Ellen White witnessed the Sabbath as God's weekly promise. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. You are not defined by your productivity. You are my beloved child, and this day is my gift to remind you of that unchanging truth. Each week, like clockwork powered by divine love, this gift would arrive, fresh as morning dew, constant as sunrise, reliable as the heartbeat of God himself. Through the sacred lens of her visions, Ellen White beheld the Sabbath as God's weekly love letter to a hurried world. She witnessed how this gift would transcend culture, language, and circumstance, speaking the universal language of divine affection to every willing heart. She saw it. Heaven's weekly embrace for Earth's weary children. In her revelations, Ellen White observed how the Sabbath would become humanity's sacred pause button. While the world would rush forward in endless acceleration, this holy day would offer the precious gift of stillness. Not emptiness but fullness, not boredom but wonder, not stagnation but sacred reflection. As written in Patriarchs and Prophets, to all who receive the Sabbath as a sign of Christ's creative and redeeming power, It will be a delight. She witnessed how God designed the Sabbath as a weekly celebration of relationship, not the formal, distant relationship of subjects to a king, but the warm, intimate communion of children with a loving father. In the gentle hours of this day, hearts would remember that they were not cosmic accidents, but intentional creations, crafted with purpose, sustained with love. Through her sacred sight, Ellen White saw how the Sabbath would serve as humanity's weekly reminder of grace. In a world that would demand endless earning and proving, this day would whisper softly, "Rest, you are already enough. You are already loved. Your worth was established not by your doing, but by my creating." She beheld how families would discover in the Sabbath a weekly treasure hunt for God's presence, in shared meals that lasted longer than usual, in conversations that went deeper than daily logistics, in moments of unhurried connection that revealed the sacred hiding in the ordinary. Ellen White witnessed the Sabbath as God's weekly gift of freedom. Freedom from the tyranny of constant productivity. Freedom from the pressure to always be achieving. Freedom to simply be present, to breathe deeply, to notice beauty that rushed days often missed. Freedom to remember that life was more than the sum of its tasks. In her visions, she saw how this holy day would become a weekly sanctuary for the soul. Like a lighthouse in a storm, the Sabbath would offer refuge from life's inevitable tempests, a safe harbor where spirits could anchor, refuel, and remember that they sailed not alone, but under heaven's watchful care. She understood that God had woven into the Sabbath the power of renewal, not just physical rest for tired bodies, but spiritual restoration for weary souls. Like a desert traveler finding an oasis, hearts would discover in this day refreshment for the journey ahead. Through Ellen White's prophetic understanding, the Sabbath emerged not as a burden to bear, but as a gift to unwrap. Each week, fresh mercies packaged in sacred hours, delivered with the consistency of divine love and the tenderness of a father's heart. In the sacred theater of her visions, Ellen White witnessed how the Sabbath would become humanity's weekly invitation to wonder. She saw families gathering not around screens but around stories, children asking questions that mattered, parents rediscovering the art of unhurried conversation, hearts opening like flowers to the gentle warmth of divine presence. She saw it, God's weekly reminder that life was meant to be celebrated, not just survived. Through her prophetic sight, Ellen White beheld how the Sabbath would serve as humanity's weekly reset button for perspective. In the gentle rhythm of this holy day, mountains of worry would shrink to manageable hills. Problems that seemed insurmountable on Friday evening would appear conquerable by Sunday morning, bathed in the peaceful light of sacred rest. As written in the Desire of Ages, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. She witnessed how God designed this day as a weekly celebration of creation's goodness. In the Sabbath hours, people would rediscover the simple pleasure of watching clouds drift across the sky, the healing medicine of listening to birds sing their morning songs, the profound peace found in walking slowly through gardens, noticing the intricate beauty that hurried days often overlooked. Ellen White saw how the Sabbath would become a weekly reminder that humans were more than their work, more than their achievements, more than their struggles. In the gentle embrace of this holy day, identities would shift from human doings back to human beings, precious in God's sight simply for existing. Through her sacred understanding, she beheld how families would discover in the Sabbath a weekly opportunity for deeper connection. Meals that stretched longer because no one needed to rush anywhere. Games that brought laughter, echoing through homes. Stories shared that wove generations together with threads of memory and love. She witnessed how the Sabbath would offer weekly healing for hearts wounded by life's inevitable disappointments. Like gentle rain on parched ground, the peace of this day would slowly restore spirits that weekday pressures had depleted. Hope would be quietly renewed, faith gently strengthened, love tenderly rekindled. In her visions, Ellen White saw how God had woven into the Sabbath the gift of simplicity, a weekly return to what truly mattered. Time moved differently on this day. not by the harsh tick of productivity clocks, but by the gentle rhythm of hearts attuned to heaven's frequency. She understood that the Sabbath would serve as humanity's weekly reminder that rest was not laziness but wisdom, that pause was not weakness but strength, that in a world obsessed with speed, the bravest act might be choosing to slow down and remember what life was really about. Through Ellen White's sacred site, the Sabbath emerged as God's weekly love song to humanity, a gentle melody that would play across centuries, inviting every generation to dance in the rhythm of divine grace, to find in its sacred hours not burden but blessing, not restriction but the truest freedom of all. Through the tender lens of her sacred visions, Ellen White witnessed how the Sabbath would become humanity's weekly appointment with wonder. She saw children discovering that the most fascinating adventures weren't found in virtual worlds, but in the real magic of exploring nature with unhurried eyes. Parents rediscovering that the most meaningful conversations happened when phones were silent and hearts were open. She saw it, God's weekly invitation to remember that life was meant to be savored, not just endured. In her prophetic sight, Ellen White beheld how the Sabbath would serve as a weekly healing balm for wounded spirits. She witnessed how this sacred day would offer refuge to the overwhelmed mother, strength to the weary father, comfort to the lonely heart. In the gentle embrace of Sabbath hours, burdens would feel lighter, hopes would kindle brighter, and love would flow more freely. As written in Testimonies for the Church, the Sabbath is a sign between me and you throughout your generations. Ellen White saw how God designed the Sabbath as a weekly celebration of his faithfulness. In the rhythm of this holy day, people would find evidence that someone greater than themselves was orchestrating the universe with perfect love. The same God who painted sunsets and taught flowers to bloom was personally invested in their rest, their peace, their joy. Through her sacred understanding, she witnessed how the Sabbath would become a weekly reminder that beauty existed everywhere for those who took time to notice. The intricate pattern of leaves dancing in gentle breezes, the symphony of children's laughter echoing through peaceful homes, the quiet miracle of loved ones gathered around tables, sharing not just food, but hearts. She beheld how families would discover in the Sabbath a weekly opportunity to create memories that would last lifetimes, stories told that would be retold for generations, traditions born that would anchor children in love, moments of connection that would become treasures stored in the heart's most precious vault. In her visions, Ellen White saw how the Sabbath would offer weekly renewal for spirits depleted by life's demands. Like a gentle stream refreshing parched ground, the peace of this day would slowly restore souls that everyday pressures had worn thin. Dreams would be quietly rekindled, courage gently renewed, purpose tenderly clarified. Through her prophetic sight, she witnessed how God had woven into the Sabbath the gift of perspective, a weekly step back from life's urgent demands to remember what was truly important, time to distinguish between what was merely loud and what was actually meaningful, space to rediscover that being loved by God was accomplishment enough. Ellen White understood that the Sabbath would serve as humanity's weekly reminder that rest was not earned, but given, not achieved, but received, not a reward for good behavior, but a gift of divine grace, freely offered to every heart willing to accept heaven's tender invitation to pause, breathe, and remember whose beloved children they truly were. Through the luminous tapestry of her divine revelations, Ellen White beheld how the Sabbath would become humanity's weekly school of love. She witnessed how this sacred day would teach the lost art of truly seeing one another. In the unhurried atmosphere of Sabbath peace, masks would gently fall away, revealing the beautiful hearts beneath society's hurried facades. She saw it, God's weekly masterclass in authentic relationship. In her prophetic vision, Ellen White observed how the Sabbath would become a sanctuary for genuine conversation. She witnessed how families would rediscover the joy of talking without competing with screens, sharing dreams without the pressure of productivity, listening with hearts instead of planning responses. In these sacred hours, understanding would bloom and forgiveness would flow like healing water. As written in Testimonies for the Church, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Ellen White understood how God designed the Sabbath as a weekly celebration of human connection. She saw how neighbors would remember each other's names, how strangers would become friends over unhurried conversations, how communities would weave themselves together through the gentle threads of shared rest and worship. Through her sacred understanding, she witnessed how the Sabbath would offer weekly healing for relationships wounded by life's relentless pace. Marriages would find time to remember why they began. Parents would discover who their children were becoming. Friends would reconnect beyond surface pleasantries to touch the deeper places where souls truly meet. In her visions, Ellen White beheld how the Sabbath would become a weekly reminder that love was the most important work of all. She saw how this day would create space for the tender conversations that heal hearts, the patient listening that restores trust, the gentle presence that speaks louder than any words. She witnessed how God had embedded in the Sabbath the gift of unhurried presence, a weekly invitation to practice the sacred art of being fully with one another, time to look into eyes instead of screens, to hear not just words but hearts, to offer not just advice but understanding. Through her prophetic sight, Ellen White saw how the Sabbath would serve as humanity's weekly practice ground for heaven's way of relating. She witnessed how, in the peaceful rhythm of this day, people would learn to extend grace instead of judgment, to offer encouragement instead of criticism, to choose gentleness over harshness. Ellen White understood that the Sabbath would become a weekly reminder that every person was a treasure worth knowing deeply. In the generous space of Sabbath hours, she saw how people would discover that their greatest adventures weren't individual achievements, but shared journeys of love. Their richest treasures weren't personal possessions, but meaningful connections. She beheld how God had designed the Sabbath as a weekly celebration of the truth that we were created not for isolation, but for communion, not for competition, but for collaboration in the beautiful work of loving one another well. In the sacred galleries of her prophetic vision, Ellen White witnessed how the Sabbath would become humanity's weekly invitation to creative wonder. She beheld how in the gentle spaciousness of this holy day, dormant gifts would awaken and hidden talents would bloom like flowers after rain. God had designed the Sabbath as a weekly permission slip to explore the beautiful capacities He had planted within every human heart. She saw it, the divine artist teaching His children to create with joy. Through her illuminated understanding, Ellen White observed how the Sabbath would free people from the tyranny of mere survival, offering sacred time to discover what made their souls sing. She witnessed how in the unhurried atmosphere of this day, people would remember that they were created not just to work, but to wonder, not just to produce, but to participate in the ongoing miracle of creation. As written in Education, true education means more than the pursuit of a certain course of study. It means more than a preparation for the life that now is. It has to do with the whole being and with the whole period of existence possible to man. Ellen White understood how the Sabbath would become a weekly classroom for the soul's deepest education. She saw how in these sacred hours people would discover poetry in their hearts, music in their voices, stories in their experiences, beauty in their perspectives. The Creator, who painted sunsets and composed symphonies of bird songs, had gifted each person with unique creative capacities waiting to be explored. In her prophetic sight, Ellen White witnessed how the Sabbath would offer weekly freedom from the false belief that creativity belonged only to the professionally gifted. She saw how ordinary people would discover extraordinary beauty in simple acts of creation, in gardens, lovingly tended, meals thoughtfully prepared, stories gently shared, songs quietly hummed. Through her sacred visions, she beheld how the Sabbath would become a weekly celebration of divine imagination, expressing itself through human hands and hearts. She witnessed how children would build kingdoms in sandboxes, while adults remembered the joy of play, how families would create memories more valuable than any purchased entertainment. Ellen White saw how God had embedded in the Sabbath the gift of unhurried exploration. Time to try new things without pressure to excel, space to create without demand for perfection, freedom to express without fear of judgment. In the generous atmosphere of Sabbath rest, she witnessed how people would rediscover that creativity was not about producing masterpieces, but about participating in the joy of making something beautiful, meaningful, or helpful. Through her prophetic understanding, Ellen White beheld how the Sabbath would serve as humanity's weekly reminder that they were made in the image of a creator God. She saw how, in the peaceful rhythm of this day, people would remember that they too were designed to bring beauty into being, to transform the ordinary into something special, to participate in the ongoing work of making the world more wonderful. She witnessed how the Sabbath would become a weekly invitation to see through the Creator's eyes, to touch the world with creative love, to add their unique brushstroke to the masterpiece of human experience. In the tender depths of her prophetic vision, Ellen White witnessed how the Sabbath would become God's weekly hospital for wounded hearts. She beheld how this sacred day would offer healing balm to souls carrying invisible burdens, gentle restoration to spirits worn thin by life's relentless demands. The Creator had woven into the very fabric of the Sabbath a divine therapy session, available freely to all who would accept its merciful embrace. She saw it, the great physician, making house calls every seventh day. Through her illuminated understanding, Ellen White observed how the Sabbath would become a weekly sanctuary for those carrying secret sorrows, hidden disappointments, or quiet desperation. She witnessed how in the gentle rhythm of this day, stressed hearts would find permission to slow down, anxious minds would discover space to breathe, and weary souls would remember that healing was possible. As written in the Ministry of Healing, Christ's method alone will give true success in reaching the people. The Savior mingled with men as one who desired their good. He showed his sympathy for them, ministered to their needs, and won their confidence. Ellen White understood how the Sabbath would minister to the deepest human needs for acceptance, belonging, and hope. She saw how, in these sacred hours, people carrying shame would discover grace. Those feeling forgotten would experience divine attention, and hearts heavy with guilt would find the possibility of forgiveness. In her prophetic sight, Ellen White witnessed how the Sabbath would offer weekly permission to acknowledge pain without rushing to fix it. She saw how, in the unhurried atmosphere of this day, people would find courage to be honest about their struggles, to sit with their emotions without judgment, to trust that healing often begins with simply being witnessed in our vulnerability. Through her sacred visions, she beheld how the Sabbath would become a weekly reminder that brokenness was not the end of the story. She witnessed how people would discover that their wounds could become windows to compassion, their struggles could become sources of strength for others, their scars could become testimonies of survival and hope. Ellen White saw how God had embedded in the Sabbath the gift of emotional sanctuary. Time to feel without pressure to perform, space to grieve without shame, freedom to hope without having to explain why. In the accepting atmosphere of Sabbath rest, she witnessed how people would rediscover that healing was not about becoming perfect, but about becoming whole. Through her prophetic understanding, Ellen White beheld how the Sabbath would serve as humanity's weekly reminder that they were loved in their brokenness, valued in their vulnerability, and held in their healing journey. She saw how in the gentle rhythm of this day, people would remember that the God who created them was also the God who could recreate them, restore them, and renew them. She witnessed how the Sabbath would become a weekly invitation to trust in divine timing, to rest in unconditional love, to believe that what seemed impossible in human strength could become possible through divine grace. She saw how every seventh day would whisper to wounded hearts, "You are not abandoned, you are not forgotten, You are deeply, eternally beloved. In the culminating vision of her prophetic sight, Ellen White beheld the ultimate purpose woven into every Sabbath sunset, every sacred moment of rest, every gentle reminder of divine love. She witnessed how each weekly celebration was not merely a memorial of creation past, but a living preview of the eternal Sabbath that awaited all who would embrace heaven's invitation to unending peace. Through her illuminated understanding, Ellen White saw how every earthly Sabbath was teaching humanity to anticipate the great eternal rest. She beheld how in the weekly rhythm of sacred time, people were being prepared for a realm where stress would be unknown, where hurry would be foreign, where peace would be the very atmosphere they breathed. She saw it, the weekly rehearsal for eternity. As written in the Great Controversy, the Sabbath will be the great test of loyalty, for it is the point of truth especially controverted. When the final test shall be brought upon men, then the line of distinction will be drawn between those who serve God and those who serve him not. But Ellen White understood that this test was not about fear, it was about love. She witnessed how the Sabbath would reveal hearts that chose divine rhythm over worldly rush, heavenly values over earthly pressures, eternal perspectives over temporary gains. In her prophetic vision, she saw how this choice would be, motivated not by obligation, but by deep, transforming love for the Creator who first loved them. Through her sacred sight, Ellen White beheld how the Sabbath would serve as humanity's weekly invitation to practice for paradise. She witnessed how in learning to rest without guilt, to worship without distraction, to love without condition, people were developing the very character traits that would fit them for eternal life. In her final understanding of the Sabbath's profound purpose, Ellen White saw how this sacred day would become the bridge between earth's imperfection and heaven's perfection. She witnessed how through weekly Sabbath keeping, people would gradually learn to value what God values, to find joy where God finds joy, to rest in the assurance of divine love. Ellen White saw how the Sabbath would whisper to every generation, "This is what heaven feels like. This peace you experience, this joy you discover, this love you encounter, this is just the beginning. What you taste on earth's Sabbaths is but a small preview of the eternal feast that awaits." Through her prophetic vision, she beheld how the Sabbath would prepare hearts not through fear of judgment, but through the irresistible attraction of divine love. She witnessed how people would choose God's ways, not because they had to, but because they had tasted something so beautiful, so peaceful, so fulfilling, that they could never again be satisfied with anything less. In the closing moment of her sacred understanding, Ellen White saw how every Sabbath sunset would be both an ending and a beginning, the close of another week of grace, the opening of another chapter of hope, the promise that one day the Sabbath rest would never end. She witnessed how the final Sabbath on earth would usher in the eternal Sabbath of heaven, where the God who rested on the seventh day would rest with his people forever. She saw it, and her heart was filled with unspeakable joy.